Thank you, Aaron. So good morning, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, colleagues all over the world. Nice to see you all over here. And thank you for joining us for this Behavioral Insights webinar. My name is Lorraine Shamala. I am a behavioral scientist. I work with the C4D polio team here at headquarters. And we're currently working in collaboration with the UNICEF C4D team and with Dr. Laurie Foster, who some of you might have met or heard before in one of these talks. She will provide support to UNICEF and it will be a cross-cutting with different technical programs. We wanted to use this webinar to be a broader immunization C4D webinar because we thought it would be a good introduction session with practical examples that one can refer to. Our plan is to do a more polio-specific webinar down the road. And before we start, I'd just like to do a quick introduction of Laurie and Joey. So Dr. Laurie Foster is a visiting scholar with Duke University with the Center of Advanced Hindsight. She is also professor of industrial organization psychology at North Carolina State University and at the University of Cape Town, South Africa. She previously worked as a fellow with the Obama White House Social and Behavioral Science team and as a behavioral science advisor to the United Nations. She has over 20 years of experience both nationally and internationally. And Joey is an applied researcher, a behavioral researcher at the Center for Advanced Hindsight. He is currently on extended secondment with them, and he is from previously with the central government of the UK, and he is a principal behavioral scientist. So I'm going to hand this over to Laurie, but before that, I would also like to thank my colleagues at headquarters for all their support, with special thanks to Aaron and to Jared, who have been the operational hands behind this whole webinar, and will also be doing the facilitation from here. So with that, I'm now going to hand it over to Laurie. Thank you, Laurie.
Thank you, Lorraine. Thank you, Aaron. Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning. I want to thank you for the opportunity to present today with my colleague, Joey Sherlock, on Behavioral Insights for Measurable Change. We also wanted to thank Marie and Marie, who are doing translation for us. So very happy that you could all join us today. As you can see, our title is Behavioral Insights for Measurable Change. And if we move to the next slide, we'll give a quick overview of what we plan to cover. I will highlight one word in the title, measurable. We'll be going through several examples of behavioral insights today to illustrate the concept. And if you pay close attention, you'll see that each example offers an index of how much change resulted from the behavioral insights intervention. And that is one of the hallmarks of this behavioral insights or BI approach. So we will kick things off in a moment describing the team that is working with UNICEF to apply behavioral insights broadly to a number of different challenges, including polio, followed by a definition of BI. Then we will illustrate this with several examples. We'll walk through the BI methodology that we typically use when we're looking to affect change. And finally, some concluding words on BI, C4D, and polio. So I'm very happy to be part of a bigger team. And that team comes from North Carolina State University and Duke University's Center for Advanced Hindsight. Joey, I would love for you to kick things off by describing a little bit about the team and how we work.
Great. Hey, just to echo the excitement and thanks for having us today. Yeah, really glad to be here and looking forward to this next hour or more. So we at the Center for Advanced Hindsight are essentially an applied behavioral science research center. So broadly, and I'll go into a little more detail, that means we fit in the space between academia, between sort of the insights and learning that goes on at our respective universities, and policy and practice and administration. So trying to bring innovation from one to the other and vice versa. So our overall goal, our overall purpose is to use behavioral science to help make people happier, healthier, and wealthier. And we look to do that both domestically within the US, but also focusing a good deal across the world on different programs. We deliberately structure ourselves with a very interdisciplinary team. So we sort of start from the position of often some of the biggest and pithiest and knottiest challenges are not necessarily solvable by just relying on one methodology or one approach. And so we deliberately bring together a diverse mix of people who have skills that are either academic, so we have postdocs and professors, but also we have design skills and development skills, and people who are very skilled in the applied side as well. Deliberately bringing together this pool of people to be able to enact innovation and change. So we pull from sort of three main areas, three main tools in our toolbox: behavioral economics, human-centered design, and rigorous evaluation. So from the behavioral economics perspective, we're looking to take an understanding, and Laurie will go into this more shortly, but taking an understanding of how humans think and behave, and understanding the nuances, the heuristics we use to make decisions, and where they lead to biases, understanding those biases so that we can make change. Human-centered design, this is, or I should say, sort of participatory learning, so looking to understand a given context through observing, understanding user needs. This is, I think, similar to C4D, or a lot of the methodologies within this probably are similar to C4D. I think these are very, very compatible approaches. But essentially, we're looking to understand the context through user lens, but then also looking to take ideas and iteratively prototype them through a series of stages to take it from just an idea to something that works in the real world. And then finally, the rigorous evaluation piece is look, we very much base ourselves on evidence, and we look to design things that are based on evidence, but we're also looking to contribute to evidence. So as and when we develop ideas that we think will work in the field, or we have some feedback that they seem to be working, we very much want to test those in the most rigorous way to, as Laurie mentioned, enact measurable change. So we're trying to do that as scientifically as possible. So sort of to summarize all of this, I think where we fit and what we're trying to do is bridge this gap between academic insights and the work that comes out of academia, and bridge the gap from there to policy and practice in the real world. So we deliberately fit in the middle of those two, and we try and bring innovation in an applied way using these previously mentioned tools as the vehicles. Okay, so that's what we're about. I think we now have a poll. I think Erin will read it out.
Thank you, Joey. Before we start the poll, I want to check in on our French speakers. We have some feedback that the English, that is the undertone, is too loud and it's difficult to hear the French. There is an option with the, if you click interpretation, you should have an option after you select French. There, underneath it says to mute original audio. I'm not sure in French. You can click that to mute the English, and you should only hear French. And I'll just give one moment if the interpreters can ask if that feature is working well for others. Or Marie, if you just give us a feedback in the English channel that this issue is on how large this issue is. In the meantime, everyone can review this poll, and I will open the poll. The poll is in French on the left, English on the right. You can look at the text, and the poll itself will appear on your screen in a moment. It is only in English. So I will give you a minute to select your answer on why you came to this webinar today. Is it because you've never heard of BI before and you want to learn more? You have a basic understanding. Option 3, you have an advanced understanding. Or option 4, you were asked to attend. And if you are a French speaker, you are able to move the green poll box on your screen so that you can read the French underneath on the slide. Okay, so we have 195 people on the call today. I'd love to hear from each of you. And so I'll keep the poll up for another 20 seconds so you can make your selection. Okay. So we still have a few votes coming in, and with so many participants on the call, I want to make sure we hear from those who wish to participate. So just another 10 seconds and we'll close the poll. And once again, if you have any audio issues or issues with translation, please use the webinar chat to let us know. Okay, with that, we've had 110 responses. I'll close the poll. We'll use this feature at 2 more points in the webinar to hear your responses and to hear more from you. Okay, and now I will show the results on who we have on the call and the level of their knowledge. So it looks like the most popular response was that 43% of you have a basic understanding of BI, and I will turn it back to Joey to comment and continue the presentation.
Okay, well, maybe I will jump in here if I may. And so thanks for participating in that poll. Looks like many folks on the call are relatively new to BI. A number of people have a basic understanding, are interested to learn more, and we have a few BI experts on the call as well. So hopefully there will be something in here for everybody, some new examples that you haven't heard before, and also introduction for those of you who are coming to it fresh. So we are going to go next on a definition of what is behavioral insights. And if we move to the next slide, we will have a definition from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, who defines behavioral insights as lessons derived from the behavioral and social sciences, including decision-making, psychology, cognitive science, neuroscience, organizational, and group behavior. And what you can see from this definition is that behavioral insights is a very multidisciplinary field of study. It's really taking the best and most practical, useful insights from a wide range of social and behavioral sciences and applying them to the challenges that face us. If we move to the next slide, I'll note that we conceptualize behavioral insights as one tool in a bigger toolbox. So we very much enjoyed working with UNICEF's Communication for Development, C4D, over the past few years. And we understand that C4D has the charge of social and behavioral change within UNICEF, which is a big job in collaboration with other UNICEF colleagues. And we also understand that there's a wide array of tools that C4D uses to tackle the challenges that you're facing. We envision behavioral insights as one of those tools. And as we'll discuss a little bit later, it's not always the right tool, but it's sometimes the right tool. So the idea is to get us familiar enough with BI so that we know when it's precisely the right tool to use to address the challenge at hand. If we move to the next slide, I'll note that this certainly isn't the first time that UNICEF has been talking about behavioral insights or BI. Here's one example from 2016, a blog titled "From a Human Face to Human Emotion, Valuing Feelings and Development." And the author states, quote, "Embracing the idea that human beings cannot be understood solely as Homo economicus has now inspired a whole new field, behavioral economics, where psychology and economics interact," unquote. And I will highlight 2 phrases from this quote. One is behavioral economics. So Behavioral Insights BI is very closely aligned with this notion of behavioral economics. So you'll hear us using those terms sometimes somewhat interchangeably. The other phrase from the quote that I wanted to highlight is homo economicus. So this is kind of a funny term and a phrase that some of you may not have heard before. It comes from a book which is featured on the next slide called Nudge. The book Nudge was written in 2008 by Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein. Thaler later went on to win a Nobel Prize in economics a few years ago, in large part for the influence of this book. And in the book, they highlight how behavioral insights can be used to address a wide range of challenges related to health, wealth, and happiness. And they use this term, homo economicus. They contrast that with the more familiar term to most of us, homo sapien. So what's the difference between homo economicus and homo sapien, and why does it matter? On the next slide, I'll show a picture of two characters, which illustrate the difference between homo economicus and homo sapiens. If you know these two characters, then I probably don't need to say another word. But if you don't know these two characters, then allow me a moment to explain. So over on the left-hand side, we have the character from the series Star Trek. His name is Spock. And Spock represents homo economicus because Spock is extremely rational, as is this mythical character, Homo economicus. Homo economicus is hyper-rational, always optimizes, always makes the best decision that is in his or her long-term interests. Homo sapiens, on the other hand, are you, me, and depicted here as Homer Simpson from the series The Simpsons. I say it sometimes this way, that imagine if somebody came into the room with a tray full of desserts, and we've got chocolate cake, we've got cookies, and we've got a healthy bowl of fruit, and we need to pick out which dessert we want. If you were Homo economicus, or Spock, you would look at the options, you would weigh the pros and cons of each option, and then ultimately you would choose, regardless of how you feel, the option that is in your best long-term interest, which is likely to be the fruit. If you're Homo sapien, you, me, or Homer, you even think about a donut and you get distracted and you go for it. Because Homo sapiens are myopic, we get distracted, we get tempted, and we don't always make the decisions that are in our best interests. The reason why this matters is because, as Thaler and Sunstein would argue, too often our policies and our programs are not designed for Homo sapiens. Rather, they're designed for Homo economicus. They assume that we're always going to take in all the information and make the best, the most optimal decision. And that's not reality. That's not us. So if you move to the next slide, I want to tell you a little bit about how this applies to all of us. So sometimes when I'm giving this talk live, I'll pick on my audience a little bit, and I'll ask them, I'll say, okay, think to the past 4 weeks. How many of us in the past 4 weeks, the past month, have perhaps eaten a little bit more than we think we should have? And I would have to raise my hand. How many of us have not exercised as much as we should have? How many of us have not gotten as much sleep as we should have? And the point is, do we need somebody to join this webinar to educate us on the benefits of exercise, nutrition, and sleep? Probably not. We have the knowledge, we have the information. Do we need somebody to persuade or convince us that exercise, sleep, and nutrition are good for us? Probably not. Most of us are sold. We're bought into that concept. And yet, we don't always consistently follow through with our good intentions. That's reality. That's Homo sapiens. And in a way, that's good news. Because if we can understand those human tendencies, then we can begin to design solutions that take them into account. What are the reasons what are the reasons for that intention to action gap? That's what we sometimes call it in BI. There's a famous scholar on the next slide who has spent a large part of his career kind of understanding the different biases and the different barriers that stand in the way of our intentions to actions. They include things like the present bias, things like distraction, things like loss aversion. There are a number of different barriers and bottlenecks that stand in the way. His name is Daniel Kahneman. He has worked for many years, some of those years with his close research partner, Amos Tversky, to really understand the way that people think, what those barriers, bottlenecks, biases are, what makes us Homo sapiens. He wrote a book called Thinking Fast and Slow that some of you might be familiar with. Daniel Kahneman also won a Nobel Prize in 2002 in economics for his groundbreaking work to understand the human mind and the implications of the biases and the errors that we make. So his book is called Thinking Fast and Slow, and he would argue on the next slide that there are two different ways in which we process information. He calls them System 1 versus System 2. System 1 is intuition and instinct. So it's our fast and frugal processing. It's unconscious, it's quick, it's autopilot. It's us getting up in the morning and have a lot of things to do and getting through the day, thinking about things really, really quickly, sometimes on autopilot, where we're not fully processing and yet we're making decisions along the way. We also have our System 2 mode of thinking, and that's the slower, the more deliberate, the logical, the rational thinking. But what Kahneman would argue is that we're not equally likely to engage in these two modes of thinking. In fact, we spend much more time on System 1 than System 2 thinking. This is interesting to note because when we realize this and when we really take the time to understand that System 1 mode of thinking, then we can design decision environments that accommodate it. That's a concept depicted on the next slide known as choice architecture. So just like an architect for a building, will have her or his set of tools to construct that building, a choice architect, a behavioral economist, also has a set of tools to design a decision environment that will nudge people in one direction or another without robbing them of their freedom of choice. So what does choice architecture mean? We're going to give you several examples, but we'll start out with just a very quick and a very simple example on the next slide. So this example of choice architecture comes from a number of colleagues, Keller et al., who tried to figure out whether simply redesigning the form that people use to sign up for a flu shot will influence their intentions to get the flu shot. And you've got over on the left-hand side of the screen form number 1, which says, place a check in the box if you will get a flu shot this fall, versus form number 2, which has two options. Number 1, I will get a flu shot this fall, or number 2, I will not get a flu shot this fall. Now, if we were to take this at a purely rational level, these two forms are essentially asking the same thing, right? I mean, they're asking you to check a box if you want to get a flu shot. But you will see that they're constructed differently. And the choice architect would predict that people, when they are asked to make an active choice, such as in form 2, would predict that they'd be more likely to opt for a decision like a flu shot in that active choice scenario. The results are on the next slide, and the hypotheses were confirmed. So what they saw in this study, where they randomly assigned people to one form versus the other, is 62% of the participants who were randomly assigned to receive form 2 opted for the flu shot, versus 42% of the participants who were randomly assigned to form 1 opted for the flu shot. Now, I have to say, we don't know in this particular study whether people followed through with that intention, but there are other examples from behavioral insights that we'll show you in just a few minutes where we took it a step further and we actually did look to see whether people followed through. and are able to demonstrate that using BI not only affects intentions, but also affects behaviors later on down the line under the right circumstances. So that's just a quick definition, a little bit of the history, the scholarship behind this, a quick example of choice architecture. Now we'll dive a bit deeper into the precise methodology that we use as behavioral scientists to execute on a BI project. And with that, I will turn it over to Joey.
Thank you very much. So as Laurie mentioned, we'll next talk about methods. Methods are really important and often undervalued and overlooked. Really, a lot of the value from the work that we do comes from the methodology. And that's not just necessarily the rigorous evaluation, but also the methodologies that enable us to generate innovation. This is often the sort of silent, unsung hero. So the framework that we like to use from a methodology perspective is this DDDT framework that has define, diagnose, design, and test as the 4 stages that we look to go through on any given project. So to give a quick overview of each, in the define section, we're looking to really narrow in on exactly what is the problem that we're looking to tackle, and then more specifically, what is the behavior that we would like to change. So try and get as sort of uncomfortably specific as we can at this point. In the diagnose phase, we're looking to understand the challenge. We're looking to understand the context, and this is where we would bring in some of the more participatory learning, the C4D, the human-centered design techniques to get a great I guess an angle on the context that we wouldn't previously have, or we wouldn't have from a standard vantage point. In the design phase, we're looking to take ideas that come out of the diagnosis phase and take them from just an idea, just a simple concept, through a series of iterative steps to get to a point where we have a version of the idea that is working. It's at this point that we'll bring in prototyping as a concept and as a set of tools. We'll also look to apply the behavioral insights and the behavioral science, the behavioral economics that we've just been talking about, to overcome the barriers that we've identified in the previous stage. And then finally, in this test phase, we're looking to really test rigorously to understand whether or not this works. Often, and most desirably, this will rely on randomized controlled trials. Okay, so to give you an example, just to sort of illustrate this, to bring it to life, I'll talk through an example from Kenya. So the challenge here was that researchers were looking to ultimately reduce world hunger. And so they started with this broad goal of how can we reduce world hunger. They then, so as part of the define process, looked to narrow that. Okay, so how can we tackle world hunger? One way is to try and produce more food. How can we produce more food? One way is to make crops more productive. How can we do that? One way is to increase the amount of fertilization that farmers use. And so we're starting to, you can see through this define stage, narrow in on okay, encouraging farmers to increase fertilization is a challenge. And so when they looked to understand that further, they realized that lots of farmers had an intention in Kenya to fertilize, but didn't necessarily follow through. So we have this very specific defined behavior now. We want to encourage farmers who intend to fertilize to fertilize. Okay, so then moving on to the diagnosis phase, why is it? You know, these farmers have this intention, why are they not doing it? And they, through exploration, understood that one of the challenges was this temporal disconnect between the end of the harvest, when farmers would have sold crops and would be flush with cash, and then when they needed to plant or when they needed to use fertilization, which was more at the beginning of the next season. So there's this big sort of temporal gap where, you know, money gets lost. Humans, as Laurie mentioned, we're myopic, we're short-sighted, we don't necessarily do a great job of planning for the future, we're Homer Simpson, and so we don't necessarily make the rational decision to invest in fertilizer at the end of the harvest. Another barrier that came out was simple friction. You know, when farmers were busy and looking to get their crops up and running at the beginning of the season, it was another thing that they needed to go and do to get fertilization. It was difficult. So,
Sorry, this is Lorraine. If you could just slightly slow down a little bit for the interpreter, please.
Oh, I'm sorry. I can, of course. So in this, in the design phase, they looked to design interventions that overcame these barriers. So they designed a program where farmers would be able to purchase a voucher for fertilization at the end of the harvest rather than at the beginning of the next one. And then that voucher would be valid in the next harvest. And further, that the fertilization would be delivered to them to overcome this barrier of friction. And then finally, moving on to this last phase, the researchers in this context tested the intervention in a rigorous randomized control trial to show that it did work to increase fertilization. All right, so that's quite a nice example of the process all the way through. I will now pick on some specific methodologies as part of this process and highlight those. So one in particular that I'd like to highlight is this idea of using laboratory tests to do rapid pre-testing as part of our process. And so this would likely fit into our design phase, or in some circumstances it might replace the test phase, but really it's looking to take our ideas and develop them further. So relevant to this context, one of the things that we at the center are interested in exploring is how we can convince people to get vaccines. Now, this is a really difficult challenge, not least because there are some people for whom it's really, really difficult to persuade them otherwise. It's also difficult to necessarily access these people in a field environment. It's difficult to set up a situation in which we can test these ideas in the real world. And so what we did in this context was to try and understand from laboratory experiments a little bit more about vaccine persuasion. So we wanted to test, in this lab experiment, we tested 3 different ideas, 3 different ways that we thought we could manipulate individuals in a lab context to be more open to getting a vaccine. So we asked people to come into the lab context, and we put them into one of 4 conditions. The first was just a simple control group. We put people into a control group in which they asked questions. We asked them questions about how amenable they were to vaccines. We then had 3 conditions where we asked people to write about different things. In one of the conditions, we asked them to write about something that was a threat to their self-esteem, something that didn't make them feel very good. In the second condition, we asked people to write about how they were a good parent. So write about a time in which they did a really good job as a parent. And then in the last condition, we asked people to write about how they were smart, how they were clever and intelligent in a time when they had been clever and intelligent. And then we asked people, as in the control group, about how open they were to vaccines. And what we found was that when we asked people to write about how intelligent they were, so evoking their sense of identity around their cleverness and bringing that to the fore, we found that led people to be more vaccine ready or more amenable to vaccine persuasion. Now, this is interesting. It's a very small, quick lab study that we can do as part of a longer, wider process, but it gives us a stepping stone from which we can then develop field experiments or develop rather interventions that can be used in field experiments. Okay, so I'm going to give one last example here, and this one is actually, it's a little different. It comes from a field context. It's an actual field study, but it's done in a slightly more controlled environment, or not necessarily controlled, but a slightly more easier to access environment. Essentially, this was done on our university campus among undergraduate students. So for us, that's easier to get our hands on. What we did in this context is we were looking to influence the number of Duke undergrad students who got a flu shot. And we were interested in testing the different incentives that students get when through this process. We had 2 conditions in this study. In one condition, we just had traditional incentives where we offered people a chance to win a $20 gift card if they came and got an incentive. Now, in the other condition, we were interested in the social nature by which undergrads go through their whole undergrad career. But in this context, how they work together or they influence each other to get a flu shot. And so we developed an incentive structure that was dyadic in nature, such that if two undergrads from the same room or the same dormitory came in to get a flu shot, they both had to come, and if they both came, they would both be entered into the lottery to win this $20 gift card. Now we're introducing this element of you have to bring someone else, which actually makes it harder. This adds friction, makes it more difficult for someone to come because they have to find the other person, line up each other's schedules, and come together. And so at first glance, this looks like it might reduce the amount of people that get a flu shot. However, when we tested it, we found that it actually, very, very marginally, this is the first study and we need to explore this further, but very marginally looked to increase the proportion of people who got a flu shot, which suggests that the social world around us and the pressure that comes from that has a really, really big impact on our behavior in this context. One thing I should flag is, and this is where we need to explore this study further, is lots of the students in the population never remembered getting the card. That doesn't necessarily mean that they weren't influenced by it, but it means that it wasn't having a big impact on their attention because it wasn't registering in memory. And so this is an area, this study needs more exploration, but it's another example, this time not necessarily in the lab, but more in a sort of a controlled field experiment that we can work with more quickly. We can explore ideas in a way that we can then learn from them, develop them further, and take them into wider, more difficult to operate in contexts. Okay. I will now just briefly introduce the next topic, and then I'll hand over to Laurie to give an example. So we've talked quite a bit now about field experiments, and we've talked about how we like to use those, and often here we're talking about field experiments and randomized control trials in the same breath. They're not necessarily the same thing, but we like to use them at similar opportunities. And really, this is often the backbone of our field. It's through rigorous field experiments that we're able to generate evidence which enables people in the future to build on the evidence that we've generated. So when running field experiments in this way, often we will develop interventions that have pull from a series or a range of behavioral ideas. So I won't necessarily read out this list, and they're detailed in more detail in the Exploring Behavioral Insights at UNICEF C4D tool, which Laurie has authored. But the point here is to say that we'll often pull together from a range of interventions or a range of ideas, solutions that are effective or hopefully effective in context. And with that, I'll hand over to Laurie to give an example.
Thanks, Joey. So as Joey mentioned, there's a lot more information in a white paper that will be coming out later this year. It's being finalized as we speak, called Behavioral Insights in C4D for Change. And so it considers C4D and BI together in the context of UNICEF particularly. So those who are interested, be on the lookout for that, please. But yes, there are lots of different tools in the toolbox of the behavioral economist or the behavioral scientist. And some of them were listed on the previous slide, everything from simplification to active choice that we looked at in the previous example that I gave. And it's often a matter of figuring out, as going through that process that Joey described, which tool is going to work the best, and then testing that. It's also the case where you can try multiple nudges at once, so you don't necessarily just need to pick one. And we often do that when we are field testing these different interventions. The examples that we've given you so far have been from relatively simple environments compared to the environments that many of you are living and working in. So we wanted to give you some additional examples from more complex environments. This next example illustrates the use of multiple nudges bundled together in a complex environment, in particular in Lebanon. So this was a field test that was conducted last year in collaboration with Nudge Lebanon and UNICEF. I don't know if Julianne Barungi is on the call, but if she is, Julianne was quite involved in this particular test. It was conducted with 6,160 households in Lebanon, and the goal was to increase rates of vaccination. If you move to the next slide, I'll show you the multiple nudges that were bundled all into one study. So what we've got here is we basically took the geographic region in Lebanon and we decided to test out behavioral insights intervention. We went through the process that Joey described. So it started with really pinpointing the problem that we were working with, understanding the barriers that were preventing people from going into the public health facilities and getting vaccinated. And ultimately, after a period of time, we landed on the idea of distributing calendars at the household. Now, there was already an intervention in place in Lebanon. It was called AIA, Accelerated Immunization Activity. And we decided to pair this BI intervention with the AIA initiative. What this meant was embedding nudges into the calendar that would be distributed at the doorstep. Here's an English version of the calendar that calls out the different nudges which were embedded. So you've got social norms up in the upper left that shows that more than 90,000 children have been vaccinated for free in the public health facilities. You've got in the upper right social endorsements, letting people know that this is common amongst their neighbors. You've got a commitment device where people were asked to check and make a promise or a pledge that they would vaccinate their children. You've got a calendar, which allows them to make an implementation plan, circle the date, and we're not going to tell you what date, but you circle the date at which you plan to take your children in to the healthcare facility. And finally, a messenger effect down at the bottom, guaranteeing the quality by the Ministry of Public Health. If you move to the next slide, you'll see what this actually looked like in Arabic. And using the methodology that Joey described, it was a randomized control trial. So essentially the geographic region was randomly assigned to sections of the region were the control group, and equivalent sections of the region were the experimental group where the calendar was distributed. This allowed the team working on the project to then track, right? Because in collaboration with the Ministry of Public Health, they were able to see which households were getting vaccinated and which the households were not getting vaccinated. And this allowed them to look at the rates of vaccination for the households that received the calendar versus the households that did not. If we go to the next slide, we will see the results of the experiment. So here you've got the treatment households that received the nudges, the calendar, were vaccinated at a significantly greater rate than the control households. If we were to scale this up to 100,000 households, this would effectively translate into 6,800 households vaccinating at least one child with behavioral insights than without it. So one example, again, of using this BI methodology, walking through it in a more complex environment relative to some of the examples we've given you previously. I want to point out a few things. If we look at the next slide, we'll consider for a moment, maybe one slide back, we'll consider for a moment what we did do in this experiment and what we didn't do. So what we did do in this experiment is we, oh, sorry, Joey, I think I got you off track a little bit. I think it's one slide forward. What we did do in this experiment is we paid attention to small details. So these small details in behavioral insights really make a difference, right? Because that's where we're designing for that system one processing. And when we're engaged as human beings, as Homo sapiens, in that system one, that fast processing, these small details can influence us in ways that we might not necessarily even consciously realize. So we were quite aware of that in designing this calendar, and we were making sure that the right small details got embedded. what strategies were used, question number 2 on the screen here, versus what strategies were not used, question number 3. Let me talk a little bit about what strategies were used. One, we used the BI methodology that Joey described: define, diagnose, design, and test. We also very much used this co-creation process. So this trial in Lebanon was a collaboration between UNICEF, between Nudge Lebanon, between the Ministry of Public Health, who all had a chance to look at prototypes of the calendar and weigh in and engage in the process of creating this BI experiment. The other things that we used were administrative data, right? Meaning we ran this randomized control trial, but we were able to test it using data on vaccinations that were already being collected by the Ministry of Public Health. We also chose a solution that was scalable, meaning that, you know, if in fact this calendar works, it's something that you can imagine in theory scaling up to large numbers without spending a lot of time or without spending a lot of money. Which leads me to what didn't we do? The people working on this experiment, they didn't spend a lot of time. They didn't spend a lot of money, and they didn't spend time trying to educate, persuade, or convince people why it's important to vaccinate your children. I'm not saying that you should never do that, but in this particular example, if you think about the intervention, it really had very little, if nothing, to do with trying to persuade or overtly convince people why vaccinations are important. It was really targeting the people who were prone to that action to intention gap, the people who weren't vehemently opposed to vaccinations, but were just, life was getting in the way. If we look at the next slide, I just want to highlight a really nice research study that came out in a journal called Psychological Science in the Public Interest by Brewer and colleagues in 2018. They conducted a systematic review of vaccinations, and their bottom line up front on the screen here is that when they reviewed many, many different research studies that were conducted, they found on average behavioral strategies to be more effective than persuasion in promoting vaccination. So there is a role, we believe, for behavioral insights in the space of immunizations and vaccinations. And if we move to the next slide, we will take this moment to transition and start thinking about how to apply BI to polio in particular. And what we've got for you is a quick poll. This is 3 questions, and Erin can guide us towards the poll and instructions for responding.
Excellent, thank you, Lori. So there are 3 true or false questions on the screen right now. At the moment, this is the text for the questions to give the French speakers time to read the question in French. And I will open the poll. You should see it in a moment on your screen. There are 3 questions. Please take a moment to read and respond. And if you are a French speaker, note that you can move the green poll box on your screen so that you're able to read the French translation underneath. Okay, so I will give everyone a minute to read and respond to the 3 questions. And you might need to scroll down on the green poll box in order to see the 3rd question and to enter submit at the bottom. And we currently have 189 participants on the call. So far, 30% of you have entered your responses. So we'll keep this poll open for 30 seconds. And while people are still responding, for those of you who have finished the poll, I want to highlight that in the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A box. At the end of this presentation, we will have time to ask questions to Joey and Lori. So you can, if you have a question now, you can write those questions in advance into the Q&A box. And during the Q&A session, we will read through the questions that are in the Q&A box and pose those to Lori and Joey. So Lori and Joey, now you can also take a look at the Q&A and see what questions have come in so far in order to prepare for the Q&A. Okay, so we have about half of respondents. There's still some responses coming in. So I will close the poll now, and then we can see what our impressions are so far about these three questions. Okay, and now on your screen we are displaying the results. So for the first question, randomized control trials are expensive and take a long time to do. About half of us felt this was true. For the second question, BI is like a magic bullet. It works for every problem. 45% of us felt this was false. And for the third question, I feel skeptical about whether BI nudges work in my part of the world. About 43% of us felt that was true. So I'll pass it back over to the speakers now to comment on these and continue with the presentation.
Thank you, Erin. All right, so as Lorraine mentioned in the intro, I am also a professor of psychology. And when Erin and Lorraine told us that we got to write quiz questions, you can imagine I was very excited. That's something that I love to do. And I appreciate you taking the time to respond. Also, as Erin mentioned, please do feel free to enter questions into the Q&A. We look forward to hearing what you think and answering as many questions as we can. So let me speak to each of these 3 points because I think they're all quite important. 1, randomized control trials are expensive and take a long time to do. Sometimes yes, and sometimes no. It really depends on a couple of things. One is it depends on whether you have an outcome variable that's already being collected, like the Lebanon example. Those vaccination and immunization data were already being collected, and so we didn't have to create a measure for that randomized control trial, and that sped things up considerably. The other factor is how long do you want to track outcomes for? And if you want to look at the effects of an intervention after year 1, after year 2, after year 3, then the randomized control trial will take 3 years. But you can still check results in short order. You can still check results after a short period of time. So randomized control trials, we've run some in the space of a couple of weeks, and they've been completed. Others take longer. In part, it depends on the question. And is it a question of what's going to affect immediate change, or is it a question of what's going to affect longitudinal change? So sometimes randomized control trials can be run quite quickly. The second one, BI is like a magic bullet. It works for every problem. And the vast majority of you, well, no, 45% of you, so the most popular response was false. And that would get my vote as well. I would answer false to BI being a magic bullet. Sometimes you hear behavioral scientists talk about BI and they make it sound that way. It is not a magic bullet, and it doesn't work for every problem. First of all, not every problem is a behavioral problem. Some problems are more structural in nature and need to be addressed in other ways. Secondly, some problems that are behavioral BI isn't the right fit for it necessarily. So for example, you know, if you've got a deeply ingrained social norm, I don't think a nudge, a choice architecture, is going to change people's minds about a deeply ingrained social norm. Now, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't work to try to change that. We should. It only means that in cases like that, other C4D tools might be the better choice relative to a nudge, for example. There's a saying that some of you will know that says, when all you have is a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail. And we don't want that, right? We want you to have a wide variety of tools, BI being one of them, but human-centered design, other C4D tools being others, so that you can mix and match and pick the right tool for the right problem. The third point, I feel a bit skeptical about whether BI nudges work in my part of the world. And let me look at the poll results here. True, 43% of you said true. I think that skepticism is warranted in that we don't necessarily know that just because a nudge worked in one setting, that it will necessarily work in another setting. Context matters a lot. And we have seen examples of a nudge working in one place that replicated in another place. We've also seen examples of a nudge working in one place that didn't replicate in another place. What we can guarantee is that this methodology Joey described, DDDT, define, diagnose, design, and test, that process replicates quite well across different settings. And in fact, we've seen over the past few years, behavioral insights teams and units cropping up all over the world, in government and outside of government, to apply this process in a wide variety of contexts, including the global South. So if we move to the next slide, we want to think a little bit about what all of this means in the context of polio. And I will say that we read through this report from the Independent Monitoring Board called The Art of Survival with great interest. There were several quotes that I've pulled out for the purpose of today, but the entire report was extremely interesting, looking at some of the challenges that face those of you who are working very hard to fight polio. One of the quotes on the bottom of the screen here is, "More can be done to use modern methods of analysis, such as behavioral insight research, to better understand motivation and behavior to help polio eradication." And I think that that's some clue that there's room to utilize and leverage BI in the context of polio eradication. I like that notion of understanding motivation and behavior, right? It's a big part of what BI is all about. Our colleague, Dan Ariely, often explains this in terms of friction and fuel. So he would say that changing behavior is in many ways about reducing friction, and in other ways, it's increasing fuel, providing fuel or motivating. Kind of like if you are trying to launch a rocket into space, right? You need to think about both the friction that might be getting in the way of that rocket launching, and you also need to think about the fuel, ensuring that the rocket has the fuel it needs to propel. The same thing is true with us, with Homo sapiens, with human beings. We need to reduce the friction and increase the fuel towards the behavior that we hope to see. If we look at the next slide, we will see an example on here of how BI can be used for polio. I think it's probably the most obvious thought that comes to mind when I think BI, when I think polio. It's you know, we can use behavioral insights to encourage people to receive the polio vaccination. We think an especially important population is those who are falling prey to this intention to action gap. So there's a real and an immediate opportunity to consider people who aren't necessarily wildly opposed to receiving polio vaccine, but might simply be refusing it because it doesn't conveniently fall into the patterns of their life. And if that's the case, there are some subset of people, recognizing that they are a subset, who we might be able to increase vaccination by looking at those intention to action gaps. Here's one example. This is a field study on the next slide that was conducted in India. And I know we've got several colleagues from India. You might be familiar with this one. This was conducted by a group of folks, two of whom also won a Nobel Prize last year in economics, was Michael Craner, Abhijit Banerjee, and Esther Duflo. Two of them were part of this study along with co-authors. They were looking to increase childhood vaccination rates in rural India. And in this particular study, they tried two different interventions. So intervention A was reducing the friction. Intervention A was making the vaccination more accessible by providing these mobile camps that would come around and be near to the places where the households were existing, making it more convenient. Intervention B also utilized the camps, but in addition to that, they didn't just decrease friction, but they also increased fuel by offering free lentils for each time the household came to get their children vaccinated. It was a very clever intervention in that not only did you get free lentils each time you went to get your children vaccinated, but if you completed the whole series, then you also got a set of metal plates. Then they tracked the rates of vaccination, and this included a polio vaccine, but it also included other vaccinations as well. And you can see the results here on the screen. The vaccination rates improved 18% with the reliable immunization camps, and even more to 39% with the incentive group, with the lentils and the plates. So again, another example of using a randomized control trial to test what works and what doesn't. So that's one example of how to apply behavioral insights in the context of polio. Another way to think about this on the next slide is not only to use BI to improve the rates of acceptance, which of course is very important, but also to think about how we can use BI for other parts of the system. Two examples on this slide. One would be, is there a way to use BI for frontline workers and mobile teams who are working so hard on this problem to enable them to do their jobs better? Or another example, is there a way to use BI to improve record keeping, to improve data collection in the context of polio? The reason why these two examples came to mind is because of some quotes that Joey and I again saw in the Independent Monitoring Board report. I believe we've got those quotes listed on the next two slides. So this one from page 62 says that staff at all levels should be trained to more accurately collect and more effectively respond to the data. And so that highlights the importance of data collection accuracy. And we believe that BI can actually be used to improve the quality and the accuracy of data collection. And I'll show you an example of that in just a moment. The next quote comes from page 57, which says, the best solutions will be found in the front line, but there must be well-trained, well-motivated, and skilled people. And again, we believe that BI can be used to help motivate and help skill and even help select people on the front lines for this type of work. So I'll offer a couple of examples, but the big point here is that when we think about applying BI to polio, yes, let's think about using it to increase uptake and demand, but let's also think about it for other parts of the system that have been highlighted by the IMB as important. Two quick examples, and then I'll start to wrap things up so that we can get to your questions. This first example relates to this notion of using BI for frontline staff. So if we go to the next slide, this is an example from Zambia. And Nava Ashraf and her colleagues conducted this study where essentially they tested the status quo and they challenged the status quo method of recruiting frontline health workers. In this particular context, the business as usual status quo was to recruit frontline health workers by highlighting the social benefits and how it's important to provide service to your community. So that was the old way of recruiting community health workers. Nava Ashraf and colleagues decided to try something a little bit different. They created a new recruitment ad that, instead of highlighting the social benefits and your community responsibilities, they highlighted the career benefits and the opportunities for advancement in this role. So they have two different ads, the status quo versus the behaviorally informed ad, and they tested them in different regions to see whether it attracted a different type of worker and whether that translated into different types of performance. The bottom line you can see on this slide here is that the group that was recruited using BI, highlighting the individual benefits and the career trajectory, conducted 29% more household visits and organized twice as many community meetings. So by all counts, they were performing more effectively. That's one example. The next example comes from Nigeria, and this relates to using BI to improve data collection and to improve record keeping. This was conducted by the World Bank. So the World Bank has a behavioral insights unit called Embed. They conducted this study in Nigeria where they tried a few different nudges to improve data collection accuracy and data quality. One of the nudges was a social recognition program. So in some particular contexts, they tested out this idea of recognizing people who were doing a good job at writing down the records accurately, and the section that collectively was doing the best was going to receive a special ceremony. A different nudge that they tried that is not listed on this screen was a lottery system where the better performance ratings you got, the more lottery tickets you got. And then they also had a control group where none of these BI interventions was utilized. Again, using a randomized control trial technique, they tested these interventions and compared them to the control group in different parts of Nigeria. And what they found was that the lottery didn't really work. It was inconclusive in one region. It didn't work in another region. Not all nudges work, and that's why we are so keen to test what works and what doesn't. The social recognition program did work in one state, but not in another. So again, a nudge working in one area may not necessarily translate to another. And in that particular case, it increased the record keeping accuracy by 18%. So that one just provides an example again of using BI to improve data collection quality, data accuracy. If we move to the next slide, I will summarize by saying that, that C4D, of course, in the UNICEF context, has long been tackling these kinds of challenges. And there's some natural overlap. Even as you think about that DDDT methodology, there are some clear similarities between that methodology and the approaches that C4D practitioners in UNICEF take. So I think there are a lot of natural synergies. We think that BI hasn't been fully leveraged at UNICEF yet, and so there might be room to bring these two worlds a little closer together so that we are using BI when it is the right answer to a challenge that we face. In the end, on the next slide, the idea is not to use BI all the time because it's not a magic bullet, but to challenge us all to think differently about these problems. And hopefully that process of thinking differently will lead us to new ideas, new solutions that we can test in our various contexts throughout the world. We will conclude with one last poll. Would love to get your thoughts on what you need to go forward. We realize that this is just a very quick overview of BI, And we're curious to hear what would be the most helpful to you as a next step. So I think we'll turn it over to Erin for this poll, and then we'll move on to the Q&A.
Thanks, Lori. Yeah, so the poll is open, and we'll have 1 minute to look at the questions and pick your response. We ask that you select one response only, and do note that the last option is a mixed or blended approach. So if you would like to pick more than one response, that last option is available for you. So we'll keep this open for another 20 seconds. Again, the French translation is underneath. And as Lori said, after this poll, we will go into the Q&A session. We will be using the Q&A box to gather your questions. So please do enter your questions into the Q&A box. If you are a French speaker, you are welcome to write your question in French, and we will ask the interpreters to read those for us. Okay, so I will close the poll now and see the results. And so it looks like the overwhelming choice was a mixed or blended approach, and I'll pass it over to Lori to take us into the Q&A.
Wonderful. Thanks, Erin. Yeah, I will just say that this is really helpful information, of course. We hope that this is the beginning of a conversation and not the end of one today. And so to really understand what would be helpful to you is helpful to us. If I were Lorraine, I would be saying, I told you so right now, because Lorraine predicted as well that a blended approach would be very appropriate and very helpful in the UNICEF context. So question to you, Erin, do we want to start with the Q&A box, or how would you like to begin this process?
Yes, I think we have some questions that have come in through the chat that I've added to the Q&A box. So I have a few there. The first from Dominique in the top of the Q&A box that I would like to start with. As these have come in first during the session, we'll start with these. And then if we have time, we'll see if we can have a few questions answered verbally. So for right now, I know participants throughout have occasionally raised a hand, possibly by mistake. So I've cleared all hands raised. If you do have a question you'd like to ask out loud, you may raise your hand after we get through some questions in the Q&A box. We'll see if we have time to take questions verbally. In the meantime, please write your question into the Q&A. So the first question came from Dominique, who mentions that she has a strong interest in this, has read the books that you've mentioned, and she says in most experiments and results conducted were derived from Western universities and context, and she has not seen results from the African context and conducted by African scholars. And her question is, how can we push for the design experiments in the different cultural African contexts so that the insights used in behavioral economics and social psychology can be better adapted to the local context and programs designed according to these results? And Dominique, if you'd like to raise your hand, I can try to find you. We have about 200 participants. If you'd like to add more after Lori gives her response, but hopefully that captures it. Over to you, Lori and Joey.
Thanks, Dominique, and thank you, Erin. It's a really great question. So, yeah, I think that's a great point. Much of the BI movement, if you want to call it that, started in the Western context. The book Nudge, most of the examples there are much more relevant to a Western context. We have seen over the past few years an expansion of that that's, I think, somewhat encouraging, where the World Bank's World Development Report it was in 2015, focused on mind, society, and behavior. And they really pushed us all in a good way to start thinking about applying these tools in far more complex environments, including in the African context. Lorraine mentioned at the beginning of the session that I am an honorary professor at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. So your question is near and dear to my heart as well. There is a couple of examples towards the end. Granted, it was only two, one from Nigeria, one from Zambia. So we're starting to see increased activity. It's still not enough. There's a very good research center called the Busara Center, Busara, that does some excellent work on the African continent. And I think, you know, a more substantive answer to your question is this notion of building in collaborative processes to that DDDT methodology that Joey described, right? So when you get to that point of diagnosing the problem, and when you get to that point of designing an intervention, making sure that that is, if not being led by local individuals, that they have an equal say and participation in that process. And I think that co-creation process, that participatory process during the diagnostic and the design phase can go a long way toward ensuring that we're not making mistakes and applying things incorrectly and inappropriately. Joey, did you have thoughts on this as well?
I think that last point was the point I was going to make. The key insight here is we're sort of, regardless of the context, often ideas don't necessarily translate well, and that is particularly stark when we're moving across cultures and across distances. That's dialed up even more. And so it's tremendously important that we don't come into a project assuming that what has worked in other contexts will work again. And so we need to leverage our exploratory work, our qualitative work, our lab testing, our surveys, and ultimately our approach using experimental methods to test ideas. We need to come in with this recognition that we don't necessarily know, when it's not a magic bullet, and as a result try and understand and leverage this methodology to develop ideas that will work in this specific context.
Great, thank you, Lori and Joey. Next, a short question from Angus. Has the Lebanon study been published?
The Lebanon study has, to my knowledge, it has not been published yet. There is a fair amount of detail in it, about it in the white paper that's coming out later this year. There's also a little bit of detail in the slides that are being shared from today. But if you're interested in learning more, by all means, feel free to contact me. Feel free to contact Julianne Barungi at UNICEF, and we can provide additional detail. Happy to.
Great. The next question comes from Elner. Did you use behavioral economics or BI approach to motivate the uptake of immunization services? I think we've spoken to this, but perhaps another example.
Sorry, could you just say the question again?
Sure. Did you use behavioral economics approach to motivate the uptake of immunization services?
I think this generally, sorry, Laura, I'll jump in on this if that's okay. Generally, the idea of using behavioral economics to tackle immunization has definitely been thought about. I think it's an area where we probably need further work. I know that we have a strong health team at the center who've put a lot of thought into this and run several studies, and there are examples that are available on the website. There are also lots of examples of published papers. So I think, to directly answer the question, yes, it's something that has been thought about and the work is ongoing, but also to reiterate points before, it's definitely not the case that behavioral economics has solved it.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that the problem of anti-vaxxers, people who feel very strongly against it, is different from the problem of people who aren't getting around to it. So for starters, deciding which target group you're focusing on is a good step number one, and then designing accordingly. The traditional nudge style tools tend to work better for the intention to action gap. The other thing I'll add is that as in the Lebanon example, it's helpful to remember that you can layer behavioral insights onto an existing program. So doing BI doesn't necessarily mean having to start a brand new project. In that Lebanon example, there was an existing program, the AIA, the household visits, and it was layering BI onto that existing program. So another way to think about it is how can we use BI to boost the effectiveness of a program that we already have running? Lastly, I will add that there is one slide in the deck talking about a research article from Psychology in the Public Interest, and the bibliography of that article is excellent. It absolutely provides a comprehensive listing of different studies that have been conducted to both apply behavioral insights to vaccination and also apply other techniques and tools as well.
Thank you. Next, we will go to Nasir's question from the Eastern and Southern Africa Regional Office. Polio vaccination has been going on intensely for the past 2.5 decades. Over this period, many strategies have been tried, some with great success, others with moderate success. Today, the challenge for polio vaccination campaign is fatigue. And they ask, please share some practical insights with examples of how BI is helpful to successfully deal with the huge fatigue which polio program faces, both for recipients and service providers, and also decision maker level.
I could have a quick crack at that, Laurie. The first thing that comes to mind for me, and again, start by saying, definitely not going to pretend to put out ideas now that you haven't already thought about. I'm sure some of this stuff you will have thought through already. But the first thing that comes to mind for me is, one of the reasons we have fatigue is that we are relying on people to cognitively, we go back to our system 1, our system 2 that Laurie put forward. We're relying on this conscious, deliberative thought for people to think through and make decisions repeatedly to encourage the behavior. And we require people to take steps, to take actions, to follow through. And I think that this, I imagine, contributes to fatigue and contributes to people being overwhelmed and having too much to think about, because it's just another thing that we have to think about as we go through our complex lives. And so the most simple insight that I would offer is to see where and how we can make the process as automatic as possible, as frictionless as possible. So this is, can we set things up on default so that things reoccur? Can we remove friction? Similar to that example with the farmers using fertilization, are there ways we can take friction out of the process? And that's both like physical, tangible friction, taking steps away, but also psychological friction. Can we reduce the amount that people have to think about, the amount of decisions that they have to make? And so basically looking to streamline, to simplify, and to hone the user experience so that people process less and do less and therefore get less fatigued.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. And Lorraine, did you have something to add as well?
Yes, but do you want to first, Laurie, and then?
Sure. Just a quick point on that notion of friction. There's an acronym that some of you have heard in BI called EAST, that the Behavioral Insights team came up with, EAST, that says, if you want to nudge behavior, you try to make it easy, attractive, social, and timely. And so thinking about each of those levers, but in the context of fatigue, I agree with Joey 100% that whatever we can do to make it easier, perhaps even pair it with things that people are already doing. And I know that's easier said than done, but maybe the India example is one small illustration of something, pairing it with something, in this case, that somebody already wants, being lentils. And if you complete the series, a set of plates. There are other examples of this pairing outside of vaccination. So for instance, to use a very simple example, if you'll forgive me, of people doing exercise. So exercise is something that can easily incur fatigue, not just in the moment, but over the course of a week or a month, that you just don't feel like getting up every day to do exercise. And there's some evidence that pairing that with something that you're already wanting to do or already want, such as only allowing yourself to listen to your favorite music when you exercise, at least makes it a little bit less aversive. So thinking about the friction factor, as Joey talked about, making it easy, thinking about how we can pair this either with something that somebody is already doing anyway, or something that somebody already wants. Lorraine?
Yes, I just wanted to add to that, Nasir, that one of the things we are planning to do is to actually do another session, another webinar. This was more of an introductory webinar, but in that one to focus a lot more on polio and some of the issues that Laurie had mentioned in the IMB report, and give an opportunity for colleagues to bring up some of these points that you just did and to look at other examples that can help us with our work. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lorraine, Joey, and Laurie. So we are at the end of the webinar time. There is I think one more question left, but in the interest of time, I do want to give participants, if you are going on to the next call, I'll close here, and then if people are able to, for those of you who are able to stay, perhaps we can ask the last question, otherwise we can respond to that over email. But a few points for those who have to go. Thank you so much to our speakers today, to Laurie and to Joey, for your insights on this really fascinating topic. We'd also like to thank the C4D team for working in collaboration with the Polio C4D team to bring this session together. This is a series of work that will continue, and we will keep all of you informed further down the road as this work moves forward. And thank you to everyone for joining today. And we had over 200 participants at the start of the call, which is really exciting to see this level of interest in such a fascinating topic. A few items to take note of: the recording of this session as well as the slides will be shared with all of you in both English and French after the session, along with a document that gives even further detail, a short summary of the current thinking on how this work and theories can be applied to our work. We also have the next session of our webinar series continues in August, on August 12th, with the session on digital engagement. And finally, we would love to hear from each of you who's joined the call today, your feedback on the session. When you leave the webinar, you will see a screen where you're invited to answer a 1-minute survey. You click continue, and you will be able to respond to 5 questions and give your insights on this event, on this topic, on the interpretation, etc. And we would really love to hear your feedback so that we can continue to improve. So thank you all so much for joining today, and feel free to leave the session. But Laurie and Joey, if you have 2 more minutes, there's one last question. And this question asks for what are your views on the sustainability of behavioral adjustments that are driven by financial incentives versus behavior adaptations, either short or long-term behavior adaptations motivated by social norms change?
I'll take a quick crack at this. So I think just to sort of clarify, some of the work that this question is alluding to, I think, is on how financial incentives have been shown in some contexts to crowd out intrinsic motivation. And so to break this down a little bit, broadly we have two types of motivation. Intrinsic motivation comes from just internally wanting to do it. Extrinsic motivation comes from doing something because we are financially or economically incentivized to do it. What we find in some research contexts is that giving incentives, providing financial motivation, increases behavior, the desired behavior in the short term, but over the longer term, crowds out or reduces the intrinsic motivation. So some examples here, one example is encouraging children to read books, led to people reading, financial incentives led to an increase in reading in the short term, but it crowded it out in the longer term. I think there might be similar research in exercise as well. So I think that to answer the question, this is a real concern. One of the things that seems to be a sort of a mediator or a moderator, a swing variable, is how intrinsically motivated someone is to do the behavior in the first place. So if it's something that you enjoy doing and you want to do, you're naturally motivated to do it in the first instance, then the economic incentive might not necessarily have an effect. It might increase behavior, but it's not going to crowd out the intrinsic motivation long term. However, if that intrinsic motivation is lower to start with, we then see this negative impact occurring. And so to think through in this context, one of the things to consider is how naturally intrinsically motivated are people to do the behavior in question. And if that intrinsic motivation isn't naturally very high, then we should be cautious potentially about using economic incentives. I then think the second half of this question was linked to social norms. I don't think I have a good comparison point here, but I will say that often in the looking at social norms and incentives as two different interventions, social norms can, in some contexts, lead to a similar effect size, a similar change in behavior. But of course, social norms or social norms framing is free or very cheap relative to economic incentives. And so I think that's an important trade-off to consider as well. Laurie, do you have anything else to feed in there?
Thanks, Joey. I'll just add quickly that I think you're very much on the right track, the person who asked the question, in terms of motivation, not only differing in terms of quantity, but also differing in terms of quality. And Joey was getting right at this in his response. So we can think about motivation, that fuel, as, this person is more motivated than that person. And that is true, that we can look at the quantities and compare those levels. But motivation also differs in terms of quality. There's a very good theory that some of you will be familiar with called self-determination theory by DC and Ryan. And they would argue that there's a difference between autonomous motivation versus controlled motivation. Autonomous motivation, as Joey was talking about intrinsically, is motivation that emanates more from within. Controlled motivation is, and we can all think about this, there are times in our life when we'll do something, for a particular reward, but when that reward goes away, we'll stop doing it. And that's why I really love this question, because we need to think about how to foster that, if not fully intrinsic, then at least that autonomous motivation to ensure or at least increase the probability of sustainable behavioral change. This can be applied and not only to polio vaccine recipients, but of course also to frontline health workers who are so critical to the polio effort.
Okay, wonderful. We have one last question that came in as you were answering that. And since we have still 150 participants on the call, would you mind if I take advantage of your expertise to ask this last question, and then we will close? Ibrahim, I believe from Nigeria, asked, a number of refusals to polio vaccination. People give the reason for this, for not accepting the vaccine, that they say no felt needs, or that their needs were not felt. And at times they use this as bargaining power and say, address our felt needs if you want us to take the vaccine. What BI approach would work best to respond to this challenge?
So while Joey is mulling this one over as well, it's an excellent question. I think that this question highlights an important point that we have not made in this presentation, and that's that BI does not exist in a vacuum. These interventions do not exist in a vacuum. They occur in a broader context. And to understand that broader context is important because it may in fact be the case where we need to look at the whole system to figure out the dynamics at play to pick out the best BI intervention or even to decide whether BI is appropriate. I would hope that going through that define, diagnose, design, and test methodology in a very participatory way would uncover some of those issues towards the beginning of the process, such that the behavioral scientists can either say, okay, we're going to design a nudge that takes that into account so that people understand how their needs are being felt and met. Or perhaps the BI practitioner says, you know what, this other thing maybe needs to be addressed first before we go about nudging in this context. So I realize that's a general answer to a very important question, but I think it is really highlighting this point that we need to look at the broad context in which this nudge is occurring and make sure that it's appropriate. Joey, anything to add?
Yeah, my mind, and I might be misinterpreting this question a little, so forgive me, but my mind initially went to the example Laurie gave from the India study in this presentation. And so to give some context, it is definitely the case that people have difficult and complicated lives and there's lots of stress, and we are pushed to respond to the most important things in any given moment. Often that most important thing is not necessarily the preventative medicine or the thing that will help us in the long term in a few weeks or a few months or a few years time. And so as a result, we're motivated to meet our needs and what the needs that we feel in this moment or in the short term. And so the example that Laurie gave was a really nice example of pairing something that is good for people in the long run with something that they feel they need right now in this moment to overcome that gap between our current selves and our future selves. And so, in that context, the researchers provided lentils and thalis to people to encourage them as incentives to encourage them to get immunized. So that's where my mind goes, is can we identify, so to speak directly to the question now, not to dismiss or diminish the person's felt needs, but to understand what they are and try and solve for those needs and pair that solution, that intervention, with the polio solution and intervention. So they come as a couple. So your incentive bundling would be a term that we would use here. So we're providing one need with the other at the same time. That's a little bit vague, and so we could probably get into more about what that means in the specific context. But picture that Tali example as for where I'm going.
Wonderful, thank you so much. So with that concludes our question and answer session for today. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us today. Please do take the time to complete the survey, especially if you are a French speaker. This is the first time we were able to offer our sessions with French interpretation, as well as with the French slides. We would love to hear your feedback so that we can continue to offer this on future webinars and make sure that it's of a good service for you. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining today. Thank you again to our presenters, to our organizers, to the C4D team, as well as the polio C4D team. And we look forward to having everyone in our next session. Have a wonderful day, everyone. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Erin.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Hi, Erin. Can you stay on for a minute when we